Welcome back. It's been a long time. We've missed you.
We've been imagining,
making plans,
getting ready.
Staying at home and doing our bit. We've tried our best to stay connected.
There's nothing like the feeling when we're in the room together.
It feels so good to be live again.
Hi everyone, my name is Sandrine Wasandehiro and I am delighted to welcome you to Demystifying Activism in the Arts, the Danger of a Single Story. This is going to be a panel discussion as part of Dublin Theatre Festival 2021 and thank you so much for having us. I am delighted to chair this panel as part of Gorm Media, a digital media platform that curates common ground through conversations that matters. As most of you are aware, artistry in contemporary Ireland is evolving better to capture the stories and experiences of marginalised communities. However, do these stories capture the true nature of the community, or do they form a single representation of a multidimensional beings and communities? I am delighted to be joined by four wonderful speakers who will be engaging with these topics and sharing their own lived experiences and diverse perspectives of the topic that we have today. I would like to introduce Eric, Gareth, Shiva, and Shimaka, who are all going to be talking to us today. Just some housekeeping. If you're watching and want to engage with us online, we would be delighted if you would use the hashtag activism in the hearts and hashtag DTF 2021 and hashtag Gorm Media. At any point, whenever any of the speakers are talking, just please don't hesitate to put in any of your question, as we will be doing a Q&A at the end. So this is an open conversation, so if speakers have anything to add in between the questions, please just let me know. And so we'll just begin our conversation. So the first question will go to Eric. And Eric, you are a voice of change and are quite prominent in the youth political activism space. What are your thoughts of art as a tool of activism?
Yeah, firstly, I'd like to thank you, Sandrine, for putting us here, composing this talk and allowing us to have a very important dialogue on arts and, of course, on activism too. I also want to thank Dublin Theatre Festival. I think the work they do is incredible, separate from this conversation, but hosting this conversation at this time, I think, is incredibly pertinent. I think hopefully will have a positive impact on those listening to the conversation. Hopefully people can be able to take things from it and be able to correlate our activism and arts and the work that we do for community here in Ireland and arts too. So just to start with the question, I firstly want to acknowledge the arts, generally speaking. I think it's arguably one of the most important, most fundamental things that we've produced as human beings since we've come into existence. I think the arts does something audacious and ambitious that nothing else that we've produced attempts to do. And that is to travel, to voyage creatively to our human essence, the things that make us, the things that the components that make us be the way we do as human beings. I think it transcends the material and allows us to, gauge through our sentient existence in this world the things that contribute to our experience. And it's an audacious thing that the arts attempts to do, but it does it successfully. Hence why things that relate to storytelling and parable and things that relate to music, composition. These things have been with us since Adam. When you think of successful things that have stood the test of time and have been incredibly fit, when I say fit, I mean so in an evolutionary sense, in terms of duration and durability, things that have been able to stay with us as we've progressed and evolved as human beings, ethically, morally, in terms of how we are and how we exist. The arts has been inseparable with human beings. So what the arts, I think, can do and the potential the arts has when it comes to activism and many other things is limitless. I think there's a bountiful potential. And I think the arts, what it allows us to do, as I stated earlier, is voyage to our human essence. And our human essence composes all the things that make us us. And there's a multiplicity of things that make the human being who he or she is. We're so complex and there's so many different elements and facets to who we are. There's so many things that contribute to how we exist, how we interact with one another, and the feeling that the arts gives you, whether it's a song that you hear about a particular social issue, or a composition from Mozart or Beethoven, or Chopin that gets you to think in a particular way about how you're feeling on a particular day, or whether it's watching a movie and stepping back from the drama and the theater of your own life to actually perceive in respite and peace and tranquility other people living out facets and elements of your life, so you can get to learn from with a bird's eye view about what goes into impacting the way you live, the stories and the deep messages that can get across to us, I think, and teach us a bit about ourselves and the commonality that we share with other human beings. So when it comes to activism specifically and advocating for social justice, calling out the issues that exist within society is incredibly important. But many other things successfully attempt to do that as well as the arts. When you think of a song, I don't know, Tupac Changes, for example, if you look at the lyrical content of that song, it's a beautiful musical composition that calls out particular social issues. But the deeper thing that Changes can do, the deeper thing that particular stories and theater can do, is it can show us the issues. It can call it out like politics can. But what the arts does to transcend politics, to transcend the superficial, is that it voyages into ourselves, into our spirits and our souls, and gets us to understand that these social issues, like it affects other people, can affect us because we are vulnerable, because we are complex, because we are flawed, because we can love, but we can also hate. The story of Macbeth, I think, from Shakespeare is a perfect example of the complexity that the arts can allow us to see within us. The whole concept, the foremost concept, is that of a tragic hero. Those two words do not belong in a sentence. They're contradictory. They clash. Tragedy and the hero simply are not compatible. But that explains perfectly the human being. We can be heroes in many different ways, but there's a tragic element to us too, because we can slip into a dark side. So when it comes to activism, and its attempt to try and tackle issues that affect people, problems that affect how marginalized communities live their lives. The arts can tell that story, but can also allow people to realize their commonality and the things that we have in common. And I think that can act as a fundamental basis upon which we can work together to enhance and improve the world in ways that other things cannot.
Yeah, no, I love that, and I love your sense of commonality, because I just think, like, especially just like in the last 2 years, where there's been such a division of us versus them, and really trying to connect as human beings to be like, we have these shared stories, and as I said, like as you put it perfectly, like, yeah, art does have that power because everyone has different sense of interpretation. So it is a beautiful thing to see, like, as you say, like whether or not it's music or movie, anything like that has the power to move people and really get them to question like their sense of like what it means to be human and what it means to be from a marginalized community. So just how do you think our artists and activists can best communicate when they have common ground? So like you're talking about that sense of commonality and that sense of understanding really like the transition of like what it means to be human, and how art has that power to really make us look at that and reflect on our lives, like when you are watching something or when you're listening to something, to really understand that you and your neighbor do really have that shared common sense of like you're just human beings.
Yeah, I think the element of introspection that I think is inherent in the mandate that arts provides, the moment of pause you receive when you're watching a movie and it tells you more about yourself than anyone around you has. I think that moment that it brings from us can really be incredibly important, and can get us to think and ponder about who we are and what we experience, and who our neighbor is and what they experience, and how things that they may experience that might be unequal or unfair needs to be called out, because despite the fact that they might be closer in proximity to that particular issue because of their race, their background, or sexuality, does not mean that we're too far to that problem either. And I think the more that we learn about ourselves as human beings, the more we learn about the fact that we are not immune to facing pain and facing problems, and that we have a responsibility. And I think that moment of respite and pause can allow us to come to this realization, to cater to those that are around us because of how common and similar we are, and not allow them to face problems that are not too far from us as individuals. So I think this is a huge thing that arts can allow us to do by telling stories, but also by striking that epiphany that nothing else can really reach. I can. You mentioned the element of politics that's inherent in my job of Black and Irish. I can provide a speech on a stage and I can tell everyone about the importance of fighting particular issues, but I may not move you as powerfully as listening to a composition from a particular classical musician or watching a movie can move you, because that tells you something about yourself that I cannot tell you. Using melody and beat and rhythm and acting and theater, those things are such powerful devices, powerful, and they've been with us, as I've stated, since we've been here. So I think there's a reason those tools have been with us, and those tools being used effectively to, I think, ignite a feeling of passion and community. Again, the potential is limitless, and I think it's going to have a very important role to play going forward when superficial things like politics, as important as it is, it's quite superficial. It looks at a particular layer. Focus on one layer. I think the arts can transcend that and allow us to appreciate all the layers that go into doing activism, but go into making us who we are.
Yeah, no, definitely. And like with your stance on like the power of art, and I think like people have been so creative in the last 2 years of like, really telling their story and leaving a mark on what the last 2 years would have been. So with that in mind, then I'll go to Gareth. So Gareth is the co-founder and co-editor-in-chief of Unapologetic magazine. Why is it important to you to have different perspective? And as a co-editor and chief of an emerging magazine, how do you plan to best capture these perspectives?
Hello. Firstly, I'll just say thank you for having me to Gorm Media and Dublin Theatre Festival. I'm honoured to have been chosen for this panel. So in regards to the first part of that question, why is it important to have different perspectives? Because as Eric's been saying, like, we're all different. Irish society isn't just one definition. There's so many different lived experiences. Each person on this island has had a completely different experience of what it means to be Irish, and in our day-to-day lives, there's no two people that are having the same experience. So I think the importance of having different perspectives is just to build a comprehensive view of Irish society today. That is one of the goals of the magazine, and the only way to do that is to include everyone in the conversation, not just the people that have been contributing time and time after again, but to bring in new voices and underrepresented voices into like a much more national conversation, a local conversation, whichever one is happening. So Unapologetic hopes to bring people together in that kind of sense, in particular underrepresented voices, but not just through writing, but through video, through art, through music. We really want to bring everyone together because, as Eric's been saying, people tune into different things. Not everyone wants to sit down and read a 1,000 word essay on what it means to be Irish. People prefer art, so they might like to see an art piece and that moves them. People like to read poetry. So by not, what would you say, putting ourselves into a very narrow niche, we hope to explore different themes and topics in a much more broad sense and build a much more bigger and comprehensive picture of what it means to be Irish today. Because as we all know, that's changing a lot more and the definition is shifting. And then in regards to the second question, how it's best to capture these perspectives? Just by not limiting ourselves. Why, like, people think it's ambitious to bring, so we hope to bring together like activists, artists, creative individuals, like everyone. And people think that's ambitious, and it is, but it's also needed. Because if you only say, if we only started a poetry magazine, it'll only be the people who like poetry who will read it. It'll only be the people who like poetry who will contribute. So that's a very niche topic, which is also needed, but it's just Unapologetic hopes to just bring everyone together and kind of break down a few barriers of, oh, I can only write for one group because I'm part of X, Y, and Z group or whatever. So we hope to bring everyone together under kind of one little house that is Unapologetic, to build up that little comprehensive picture. And we're hoping in the future to do things like podcasts, blogs, to keep that conversation going, because a magazine only happens every so often because of the effort that it requires to publish it. So we're hoping to keep that conversation going and not limiting ourselves to only say like a yearly magazine or bi-yearly or every 6 months kind of type magazine. So that's how we're going to bring these different perspectives together, by just not limiting ourselves and not limiting the creativity of the people that are contributing.
Yeah, no, and I think that's really important with what you're saying. Like, at the heart of these conversations happening in the art sector is that changing nature of Irishness, and by providing new places where like marginalized communities and marginalized voices are taking over these spaces, which again would have been predominantly white, and it's really really exciting to see like different works that's happening. I'm probably biased because I'm on unapologetic that I get to be like, it's really exciting, but again it wouldn't have happened if we didn't have 2020, and where it really, I don't know, we were kind of faced with our own thoughts and faced with the sense of like, how do I leave a mark, how do I become like express what I'm feeling. And as both you and Eric have said, like there's just so many different forms of doing it, and I think it's really really exciting because people now are really putting their artistry out there and are being so vulnerable with it. But again, it's contributing to these conversations that are happening, and like there's so many different people taking part in this, and like just coming onto this journey and really learning the power of the arts. And it's now a place that embraces diversity, you know, and embraces marginalized voices, where a lot of the times they have been spoken for but now are doing the speaking themselves. So like it is that really powerful element of it. And I'll come to you, Tamaka, because you're on the board member as well for Unapologetics. So I think the three of us are biased here. So you are a force in the literary world and an amazing storyteller. I imagine a lot of the artists who want to capture stories beyond their own personal world. So, how can artists best capture the stories of individual or groups outside of their individual communities?
Hello, everyone. That's a wonderful question, Sandrine. It is important that artists.
Yeah, so the question is, how can artists best capture the stories of individual or group outside their individual communities?
Yeah, so it is important that artists do try to capture the experiences of individuals and groups outside their own communities. And the sort of the best way that I believe that they can do that is through collaboration and collaborative practice. So reaching out to, I think, first of all, being aware and being educated on the creators and the thinkers and the artists that are, you know, that are making things, making ideas within your community and on the periphery and outside of that. So I think it is, first of all, that's where the responsibility begins, is in being aware of your environment, and then reaching out to those who are who have a different background to you, and who are, you know, whose art is influenced by their background and the ways that it differs to yours. And so I think collaboration is, first of all, I think a key tool in an artist engaging with the community, and with ideas that are outside of their own community.
Yeah, no, you're definitely right. And I think in the past year, again, like collaboration has been a really powerful aspect, because you've been able to see like different people who, like through like academics, activists, artists, like they're all having the same conversation, but they're just not engaging with each other. So it has been really important, as you said, to understand the power and the magnitude of having all these people collaborate, because at the end of the day, they're really there to tell their stories. And as you were saying, like it's something that I'm always saying to my first year students in literature, in regards to like when you're reading something, and like, you know, the role of the writer, like it is their responsibility, you know, to capture the stories that they're telling as authentic as it is. And the best way to do it is by talking to those communities that you want to talk to, or again through collaboration, because you can just have a better understanding and you just reach a wider scope of audience with that. So I'll come to you, Shiva. So your work precedes you, and you are such an advocate for highlighting underrepresented voices. Do you feel like these voices tend to be homogenized?
Yeah, hello to everyone. And look, I think minority voices, we know, are not all the same. Eric was talking there beautifully about the limitless potential. But what happens and what you see when you are intentionally limiting access and space for these voices is a dominant majority enforcing an editorial reductivism, So you get stereotyping, you get this kind of one and done attitude that I think is quite visible in the Irish arts. We're having a conversation here with a very polite assertion that Ireland is willingly perhaps undergoing this change and evolving. But when I reflect on what's happened in the past years, I think very strongly about just the incredible level of exceptionalism in marginalized communities among marginalized artists, despite the barriers they face to push back. And I think of how that has intersected with this wider international conversation that has been driven by Black Lives Matter about racism, and how that brought, into real light this racism and exclusion in Irish arts. It made it really starkly apparent and rightly embarrassing. I mean, I was really shocked to read that Walls and Windows by Dr. Rosaleen McDonough, who's an incredible Minka writer who, really inspires me when I hear her speak. That was the first play written by an Irish traveller for the Abbey stage. And I looked it up, and the Abbey stage is like 117 years old. And I can't fathom how this is the first, the only, a month ago. This is 21 years after the Equal Status Act made this kind of thing, this kind of employment discrimination, because that's what it is, illegal, to only have one traveller playwright's work on a national theatre stage in 117 years. It's so problematic to me because the arts drives our communal narrative. Gareth was talking there about our many lived experiences. And when I think of the arts, I think of the importance of narrative diversity. And I don't think that should be difficult to grasp in a creative context. Chimamanda's talk on the single story, which we're basing this idea and this conversation on, is 12 years old. But before that, you've had modernism, postmodernism, critical discourse theory. You've already had these things take us through the fallacy and the problematic nature of a single story and the imposition of such narratives and power structures. So, I find it difficult to understand how it's taken policy and law and international, these kind of pressures to prod the arts, the Irish arts, towards what is really just basically asking for variety and complexity, human complexity and depth. Racism is taught in these narratives. It's not innate. It's taught in unimaginative, one-dimensional, power-driven narratives. It's a failure in critical discourse in an arts context, because this is what creates our communal narrative as well. So much of my access work begins with asking questions that I learned through my art studies, deconstructing texts. Where are the gaps? Where are the silences, the omissions? Whose point of view is raised? Who's being excluded? What are the consequences of this? Who's benefiting? Who's not? Who's losing out? What is the power structure? How is the editorial gaze affecting all of this? If you look at Irish arts, there's a clear, white, settled editorial gaze, especially in leadership. And it's a space that says, we've let one in, and leads with this kind of tick box of what is acceptable to that gaze. A single story in the arts, in arts leadership, in literature, to me is the antithesis and the suffocation of creativity. So, the importance of addressing that, the necessity of addressing that is pivotal to what creativity and arts should be. And when you transpose that kind of narrative development, that communal understanding of who we are, into arts employment, into education, into health, in the construction of an Irish identity and the narrative in that single story, that one and done kind of attitude, raises more than just stories. It's an erasure of human dignity and human value.
Yeah, no, that was
Get the
beautifully
point.
said. And yeah, no, I think like with what you're saying with that human dignity, again, like it's something that I'm always thinking about doing African literature in that regards of like, yeah, who gets to tell the story and who's listening? Because again, like you can draw, anything like that. But at the end of the day, it's like who's the intended audience for that? And I think that goes back to what you yourself, Shiva and Gareth have said when it comes to like the changing nature of Irishness and really having to open up our mind in that regards to understand that there is a discourse that is changing. And that's why I always go back to like how, again, a lot of the times when it comes to marginalized communities, like they're always spoken about and spoken for, but like they're never the ones which are speaking. And again, that just becomes this accepted view. It's because no one will be there to listen. But like we've seen it, like people do want to listen. And I think like you made a really clever point there, Shiva, in regards to with the changing nature of Irishness, like this is something that goes back to the Celtic Tiger. And it is a shame that even now in 2021, we're still having these conversations. But again, I look at it in a hopeful nature of being like, at least we're having these conversations. And it shows that if there's leading people like yourselves taking the charge and taking this narrative, then hopefully then the future is bright, because you have people that, as you were saying, Shiva, like a resistance. That's what it is, because for not seeing yourself represented in the arts and claiming that space, like that's a form of resistance. So I'll come to you, back to you, Gareth. I just want you to just let the audience know more about Unapologetic.
Yeah, perfect. So, Unapologetic is a multidisciplinary and cultural magazine that brings together academics, artists, activists, and just creative individuals to build a more comprehensive picture of what it means to be Irish today. So we are doing that at the minute through a magazine, which we are hoping to launch very soon. The first issue is called Changemakers. So we asked people to kind of reflect on who were changemakers in their lives, whether it be themselves or somebody else. We just asked people to reflect on that kind of very general theme, and the response that we got has been absolutely phenomenal. Each person took a very unique perspective, and I guarantee you, when you read this magazine, which will be made accessible to everyone online on our website, there won't be two stories that'll be the same. It'll be each story, each poetry, each work of art, will captivate you in a completely different way. And in my biased opinion, you won't be able to put it down in a metaphorical sense. But I might be a little bit biased when I say that. And then Unapologetic hopes to grow beyond just being a magazine. Like I said, we hope to introduce blogs, a podcast, and whatever else we can do. The only limit is our creativity. And I can guarantee you all, Sandrine has no limit to her creativity whatsoever. So all I'll say is watch this space, and we hope that you all come join us on Unapologetic's wonderful journey.
Yeah, no. Do you know what though? I feel like the last year there's just been so many things happening that it's been so hard not to be creative. So again, like me and Gareth always make the joke that it's like if another lockdown happens, we're just opening up our new college. Like we're just gonna set one up where again you're gonna be talking about social issues, because as you were putting, Eric, like there's so many complexity of it that I think like that's why I always say like there's such power in number and power in seeing, especially just young people, like really take charge of these conversations. And Chumaka, I just want to come back to you in regards to just following up with what Gareth was saying in regards to Unapologetic. And as I've already mentioned, you're one of the board members. So just in regards to the artist and the responsibility that they have, does an artist have to be a certain background to display works of that community?
That's an excellent question. It's one that I've contemplated and reflected on for a while, just in my own personal arts practice. And I think no. I think once again, we're always hoping that works that is being displayed or that are to be displayed would have arisen from a process of collaboration with that community. I think it also depends on also what space in which the works are being displayed. What is the agenda behind it? What is the intention behind it, and what impact does the artist wish to make? But again, I have to always come back to a quote by very important writer J. Nozopo Marere, who says that until the lion learns to write, every story will glorify the hunter. And so it is incredibly important that people within their own communities are the ones who are creating and displaying work. And especially communities that are marginalized. And if an artist who is outside of that community wants to partake in perhaps an exhibition or an installation, that it is important that we have to clarify: are they trying to take ownership of it? Is there full credit given? And what is the process by which they acquired these works to be displayed? So there are questions and there are considerations. I can't really give a definitive answer because I think that because we know that historically artists and organizations and institutions of art have engaged in usurpation of marginalized communities' works and cultural artifacts, and many of which are on display in the Western world. And there are, there is discourse now about repatriation of those works that were acquired through, while they were legal means at the time, there were certainly unethical means, whether war or colonization or both. But if we're speaking of now and going forward into the future, I think we have to engage, like these interactions have to take on complexity, and they have to take on a nuance. I think it's a nuanced question that deserves a nuanced answer, and that deserves that when an artist engages with a marginalized community, that they come in with an attitude of, I think, of humility, firstly, and that they be eager to learn and eager to take on board everything that the community is telling them are sort of necessary to facilitate these works being displayed in the best way, so that there is no, reductivism, as a result of the artist's engagement with the work.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. As you said, it's like a really nuanced and complex question, because I think I've even faced that with the second documentary we're doing for Unsilencing, and is by looking at different diverse communities, but then again being like, okay, just because I'm even from like a Black community does not mean that I'm still going to understand the racism that, let's say, a traveler community would understand. And as you were saying, like, it has to be through collaboration, and the intent of the person doing the work, it has to be transparent, because again, that's a level of trust that the people that are taking part in, and versus like the artist doing that. And if I think all of you have like all echo this sense of humanity and dignified element of it, and just understanding, again, it goes back to like who gets to tell this story and who's listening, and if through this collaboration, like, is it going to be empowering the voices of the underrepresented community that you really want to tackle. And then with that, I'll come back to you, Shiva, in regards to like the underrepresented community. How can we best capture underrepresented voice without putting these individuals in a box?
I mean, I think you were doing it beautifully there in talking about the questions you have to ask yourself, and, you know, the idea that this is a nuanced situation, and the fact that you have to listen, you have to work with humility. But when it comes to the collaborative space, that's important. I think what I'm so centering here, and what's so important, is to look at the leadership in the space and to ensure that that is coming from the minority group that you're working with, or the marginalized voice that you're working with, that it's not yours directing and editorializing what's happening in that space. Being ready to listen also is accompanied with being ready to be told no, you know, and being ready for anger, for not getting defensive in that, for going and doing your own work, your own background research, and doing it well. You know, so much of this has been spoken about and exists in other communities. As you were talking there about how would you look at that kind of collaboration that isn't what we were seeing, which is just exploitation of marginalized communities, or empirical exploitation, and the modern versions of that look so friendly sometimes. I was thinking of what is talked about in Australia in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities as black cladding in Indigenous organisations, where and particularly in art spaces, where there's this pretense that it's rewarding and respecting the artists and their views, and remunerating them as well, you know, paying them fairly. It looks like that from the outside, but what's actually happening isn't that at all. It's just superficial. So, you know, I'm hearing that, and I already know there's responses to this kind of practice, that question has already been asked. You know, you can go and find out about that. So if you're looking to collaborate in these spaces, these are kinds of questions you need to ask yourself first, and have gone and looked at yourself first too, before you engage with the minority. And I think it's really important to be okay with being told no, with letting there be limitations on what you have access to. We talk often of privileged knowledge and sacred knowledge in spaces. It's not always yours to take just because you see it and you like it and you want to have it. That's what colonialism is.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really important aspect of it, of, again, saying no, because like, as you say, like, as I was saying earlier, like, with the different stories and lived experiences emerging, like, yeah, like, not every person from like marginalized communities want to tell their story, and like, that's a very comfortable thing to understand, that it isn't up to the person. So just to let the audience know again, just please keep sending in the Q&A, and we'll start answering your questions shortly. So please keep sending them in, and just don't forget the hashtags. And so I'll just go around. So I'll start with you, Eric. So this is just for everyone, so if you can just start thinking of the answer then. So as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie puts in her TED Talk, there's a danger in a single story. In one sentence, what would you describe as a danger to a single story? So I'll start with you, Eric.
What would I describe as a danger to a single story?
Yeah.
Okay. I'd say, in one word, I definitely say dehumanization. And I'd love to draw on an example that James Baldwin pointed towards in a particular essay that he wrote about a very famous novel from Richard Wright. He wrote it in the 1930s, the novelist, but James Baldwin was commenting on this novel. And what it did is it depicted a story of a young black male in 1930s America who grew up in poverty in New York, I believe. His name was Bigger Thomas. And Bigger, because of systemic racism, was led down a line of despondence and disillusionment. And that led to him committing crimes. And eventually, I think he was given the death penalty because of the fact that he committed incredibly heinous crimes. And what the novelist attempted to do was to describe the systemic atmosphere around Bigger that led him to commit those crimes. So immediately, you don't merely have a black guy from New York at this time committing a crime. He's letting you know about the poverty, about the backstory, about the systemic element to it when it came to the racism that he and his community members faced. But Baldwin's criticism of the book was not merely the fact that it pointed to systemic racism in America at this time. He agreed with that. But what he thought it failed to do was to point to the other elements of Black life. He felt like America, generally speaking, minimized Black people by not pointing to the buoyancy of the Black community, all the other contributions that Black people in America have made to the arts, to music, in the form of jazz at this time. The fact that, let's say, the Black church, for example, was so vibrant and filled with spirit. The civil rights movement was spurred with a spirit of enthusiasm and relentlessness. And this fact, of course, was missed by the novelist, according to Baldwin. And he claimed that in American theater, when they depicted Black people in the form of Uncle Tom, this is what he resorted to when he spoke about an example, an archetypical example of how Black people were depicted by white people at this time in America, by white American theater. All that a figure like Uncle Tom was telling America was not the truth of the Black experience or the truth of the essence of the Black person, but rather it was reflecting the preconceptions that many white Americans had about Black people. And it was allowing them to depict Black people in a way that was embedded in inferiority. And this did not speak to Black people, but rather it spoke to a stereotypical perception of Black people. And I think this is the danger of a single story. You can't merely minimize a human being, let alone somebody from a marginalized community, to one single box or one single story. It's impossible. It's another great author whose name I forgot. He said in his book about the Black experience that there's about if you can, I think there's 20 million Black people in America, African Americans rather, and there's about 20 million different ways to be African American, and you cannot capture all of that by minimizing the experiences of all of those people to one single story, and you're not going to have an insight as to how different people live their life from that community if you're not including them in how you construct your stories and get across a story to the general public. If you're not engaging in dialogue about their experiences, about who they are, you cannot, represent the stories in an accurate way. And I think a massive loss that will be had in terms of Irish arts, and of course I'm not as in the know or privy to Irish arts and what occurs inside as the brilliant panelists that I'm joined with, but I think a massive loss that will occur as Ireland diversifies and as our new Ireland, I think, finds its stature and comes to the fore, is if the members of New Ireland, is if Ireland's children that are not from quote unquote traditionally Irish backgrounds, if their voices are not aggrandized and if they're not allowed to use their voice to speak to the shape of the modern Ireland that they're developing in their everyday practice, we're going to flagrantly misrepresent Ireland and the Ireland that Ireland is becoming. And I think that's a huge loss. And it's something that we definitely need to work to avoid, because stereotyping and minimizing people to boxes is at the root of problems like racism. I think if, for example, in secondary school, if the people I was joined with weren't only learning about how impoverished my teacher thought Africa was, but rather was learning about all the amazing parables and stories from Africa, the contributions from African writers, was learning about the biological link between them and Africans based on, let's say, science. If they're learning about different things that have emanated from Africa that has influenced traditions across the world, like Greek civilization to some extent and the Western civilization, generally speaking, then I think they'd be able to see me more as their brother than they would as merely a Black object that was depicted merely in charity organizations, advertisements on television, or relegating me to what they saw from a rapper in the television and approaching me with preconceptions based on what they thought of that rapper, not seeing me for who I was. So this is the danger of a single story, dehumanization. And I think here in Ireland, we definitely need to try and curb that so we can open a space for understanding. And I think this, again, the potential when it comes to this, the potentiality of understanding when it comes to opening things up, to seeing more stories from different directions is so important. And the last thing I'll say is that fundamental truth that I spoke of earlier, that I think the arts allows us to get to. I think it's one of the reasons why religious texts, regardless of their contents, are so popular, because they utilize the mechanism of the parable. They tell stories, powerful stories that stick with you, that strike you. It's very easy for me to say Sandrine is an amazing writer, but if I tell you a story about how she progressed in her life and how she saw different things and how particular events brought her to the moment where she was able to write, I'm telling you far more about the fact that she's an amazing writer, but she's also so much more than that. So the story allows you to see totality and allows you to see more. I think we're missing an opportunity when we don't utilize that to tell stories of people from marginalized communities and don't include them in the process of telling those stories either. And all that will allow us to do is arrive to that fundamental truth of our essence in a different way, because there are different ways to learn about who we are as human beings. There's different ways to see vulnerability and to see pain and to see heartache. And if you look at the fundamental stories from Africa, from the Mesopotamian society, Roman civilization, Greek civilization, modern Western civilization, a lot of those fundamental truths of happiness, of joy, of sadness, of love, of sorrow, these things were got to through parable in different ways. And if we're minimizing the ways that we get there, we're learning less about our neighbors and the people that are around us and learning less about ourselves. So I think this is the danger of a single story.
Yeah, no, beautiful capture there. Very passionate. And again, you went back to that question of what it means to be human, and again, the understanding the power of complexity and that nuance that Chimaka would have said. So next, I'll go to you, Gareth, and again, we'll just keep it brief because we've been getting loads of questions from the audience. So I'd love to get a chance to answer those. So just again, what's the danger of telling a single story? So just if you could describe it in one word. Then I'll come to you next, Shiva.
Danger of a single story. For me, it is that we won't find adequate solutions to problems. I'll give a brief example of my experience as a gay man in Ireland is different to the trans experience in Ireland. And so the danger of a single story of I know if you say, oh, this solution will help gay men in Ireland, that will also help trans people in Ireland, isn't necessarily true. So if you reduce a community to a single story, you lose out on a lot of the diversity, which will then mean that the unique problems that certain individuals have in that society won't be met. So the solutions will be lackluster and we'll still have problems. So that's what I believe the danger of a single story is.
Yeah, no, excellently put as well. And what about you, Shiva? If you could just describe one word of the danger of a single story.
I think, gosh, the others have spoken so beautifully. I'm still thinking about that voyaging creatively and the expanse that you limit when you limit yourself to a single story, how you rob yourself, really, and you rob the creativity that could be cultivated here. So I suppose for me, it's thinking of it as the antithesis to creativity. A single story it's like the suffocation of that.
Yeah, no, I love that, the suffocation of it. And just lastly, Chimaka, just before we go to Q&A.
Yes, Shiva, as Shiva said, the others have spoken. You've all spoken so eloquently, in pointing out the limits to the imagination that a single story brings about, and how that really, in terms of social justice and social change, that limits the possibilities of creating new solutions. But also, I think it also further cements social isolation. It prevents people from learning about each other and from finding shared experiences in various narratives. And so we don't get to learn about others and realize that we share as many similarities as we do differences, and we lose out on the richness of human connection. I think that's incredibly sad.
Yeah, so we'll just go to the Q and A. So we have one from Eve. Are there examples in Ireland of people or organizations that you think are doing this well, or who isn't getting stuck in telling the one story? So I'll come to you, Shiva.
I mean, I have an utter bias here. I will say what Unapologetic is doing. It's so heartening to see. Like, it was just beautiful to see this space that's changing the media narrative being developed, and all the kind of artistic viewpoints being sought and heightened. But as well, I have to shout out to um, Joe DeCapati and Good Day Cork, setting up a space that was about positive media narratives, that it was about challenging, the single story, amplifying unheard voices, all these sorts of things, and beautiful community stories from before 2018, before this sort of drive happened, the awareness to see that there was an absence there. And it's a beautiful space that concurrently does this. So that's definitely a space I would say that does it beautifully. And I left the theatre space I was working in to go and work in that space for a period as a features editor, because I wanted to find a place where I could really amplify in adult spaces the voices of writers, and give them publication space, because there was such a refusal to publish narratives that were from writers from marginalized, from Black, brown backgrounds. So Joe had created a space, and I came in and was doing editorial and pieces around that. And we also published together a piece that was completely taken over by teenagers and young people. So everyone under 19 held an entire and wrote an entire magazine there, which was very entertaining and beautiful. So, like, I have been part of that and seen that there. That would be the space I have to shout about, because there's been so much work done there, and it's sitting in such beautiful hands right now.
And what about yourself, Chimaka? You're always involved in a lot of things. Would you have any suggestions for the audience?
I would suggest that they really go and check out Sky Press. They are a grassroots press that published Malutu Okere's This Hostile Life, as well as Owen de Bourdon's Why the Moon Travels, which is a collection of oral traditions of the traveler community. And I think Shiva had mentioned Rosalind McDonough's Unsettled. So it's about her experience of being Irish and disabled, and it's from a feminist perspective. This is, a publisher whose entire sort of value, vision, mission is to highlight the voices of marginalized communities, and to push those stories to the forefront. So it's Kind Press.
Okay, perfect. So this isn't really a question, so just like an observation from Joanna. So as a conversation facilitator who brings people together, I'm always looking for new voices to build bridges. And then there is my responsibility to avoid the trap of the single story. So human complexity is compromised when we focus on a single story. And I think that really matches what everyone was saying. So just lastly there, would you have any advice then for people who do want to have this conversation, so like in regards to collaboration, on how to go about to really avoid the single story? So just very briefly, so I'll start with you, Gareth.
To avoid the danger of a single story, I'd say do your research and do it properly. Don't fall into the traps of surface level kind of media representations. Go beyond that, speak to the people, get lived experiences. And I think that's a good starting point for avoiding a single story.
Eric?
Yeah, I think Garrett said it all. Maybe resort to traditional films and movies too, maybe some text also, just anything you can find. And I think in-person contact with people from particular communities who you hope to represent could be definitely helpful too, because of the authentic input.
Chiamaka?
Yeah, Gareth and Eric have yeah, they've given very great answers. Yeah, of course, do your reading, and now that we can, go out and speak to people, go out into the public. Yeah, dialogue has always been the main basis in terms of learning and building connections. So make use of it.
Yeah, and last but not least, Shiva, any advice for people to avoid the dangers of telling a single story?
I mean, the collaborative bit there has been spoken about. I think being strong in yourself and being ready to deal with mistakes as you make them, but still going on and still working at this and not leaving it to marginalized spaces to be doing it all themselves, the burden of removing barriers. But one really practical thing is when you work in these collaborative spaces and when you're building and creating, go and look at where you're placing your work as well, and question the leadership spaces you're seeing as well. Ask that question: is this a space that has a just one and done attitude? Is this a space that in its boards, festival boards, organizational boards, in its leadership and all its way down, is embedding the kind of ethos that is supportive? And if not, if you want to work in these communities, start doing that work as well. Don't just show up asking for access and insight and collaboration. Start by showing, what have you done to make the space easier for these artists as well? Because you have more agency if you're part of the majority. It wears us down and we don't get to create because we're too busy doing that work as well as the creative work we're trying to do.
Yeah, no, thank you all so much. It was such an interesting conversation, a very fruitful conversation that you all gave really practical advice in the way to move forward. And as Eric said, we are stepping forward into a new Ireland, and it's so exciting because we are having these conversations, and it'll just be great to see people from different nationalities, ethnicities, everything like that, being involved and being invited to the table when it comes to taking part in the arts. Because again, traditionally, minority voices have been left out, but we are taking the power back, and there is power in that narrative. So thank you all again so much to my guests, Eric, Gareth, Jamaica, and Shiva. And thank you so much again to Gorm Media and Dublin Theatre Festival. And thank you so much to all of the audience. I hope you really enjoy the conversation. And we can't wait to see the future of the new Ireland, where again, we are avoiding the danger of a single story and showcasing the multiplicity and the nuance that exist in contemporary Ireland. Thank you very much. Have a good night.